So in our last video, we ended right here with Philip II. His moniker was Augustus, and he purposely played on this idea that he was somehow similar to the Caesars of the past, like Caesar Augustus. And this is a coin from his reign. You can see that his crown looks like a Roman ruler, a Caesar, and not like a medieval king. It also tells you how significant the influence of Roman history and the Roman culture was throughout Europe still. And that is a constant, you could argue even to this day in some circumstances. Now, I want to pick up with this king, Louis the Ninth. Louis the Ninth was a very significant monarch of France. You can see he ruled for a very long time. When he became king, he was quite young, and he ruled for, as you can see, the years there, a very long time. And for a lot of his younger years, his mother was was his regent, and then even as he got older, she played a key role in the monarchy for much of his life. Louis extended a power further south. He basically was able to take direct control of all these areas, not just as vassals to him, but almost direct control of these areas. There were still vassals there, but his control was greatly extended into these periods, and in fact, into these areas. And in fact, during his time, they also moved quite a bit of control south, although they did not directly acquire it. The monarchy did not directly acquire it until later. But the French monarchy began to move quite a bit of power south for different reasons that I'm not going to go into here. The other thing that Louis was very well known for was his piety, and that is why he is called Saint Louis. Louis the Ninth is still in the Roman Catholic Church a canonized saint, meaning he's officially recognized by the Catholic Church as a saint. His father had been Louis the Eighth. He had only ruled a pretty short time, but he inherited this very well established kingdom thanks to Philip II. All right. He's very pious, as I said. One of the reasons why he's known for his piety was also his crusades. I'm not going to talk a lot about Louis's crusades when I talk about the crusades later, so I'll mention a little bit here. Louis actually led 2 crusades. The first crusade was around 1250, and that was to Egypt, where it was somewhat successful at first, but ultimately was a defeat. He was actually captured by the ruler of Egypt at one point. He did stay around Egypt and then later went to Palestine, quote, Holy Land at the time, but ultimately came back to France without achieving the goal of retaking Jerusalem at the time. He was also very pious in his promotion of the building of a very famous chapel called Sainte-Chapelle. Maybe I'll find a picture of that and show it to you in another slide or video. I probably should have showed a picture of that in the architecture video, but Sainte-Chapelle is a very famous building. You can still see it in Paris. If you go to Paris, I would highly recommend you going to see it. It's still beautifully decorated. It was originally Louis's chapel. And in that chapel, Louis had a number of relics, religious relics. I talked about what those were in the religion video. And one of those relics was the crown of thorns. And there still is that relic known as the crown of thorns is still in Paris today. So you can, I don't know, I think it was actually Notre Dame Cathedral, but and it was saved from the fire that happened not too long ago, about a year ago. So Louis did die on the second time Louis led a crusade. He was much older, as you can tell by the year. He died in his second crusade, not the second crusade, but his second crusade in North Africa. And so He did die on crusade. He did not die in battle. He died of just a disease. He got sick, which was very common for armies in those days. So this is also a depiction of Louis. Well, there's a depiction of Louis there. It's a fascinating depiction. It also shows his piety. So you can tell he's a king by his crown, and you can tell he's a saint by that. It's called a nimbus. You see these in art, and the person that has this kind of halo thing over around their head, it's called a nimbus, depicts them as saint. Notice his crucifix. This is his bed. Notice the fleur-de-lis symbol of the French monarchy on it. And he's allowing this guy to whip him. I guess he had his royal underwear on there too. And it's kind of an odd picture. He is the whipping there was part of his piety. It was not unusual for an extremely pious person to punish their flesh, as it were. This was not encouraged by the church for average people, but it's a fascinating depiction anyway. All right, let's talk a little bit about Germany. Now, when we talk about Germany here, again, I'm not talking about the same as a nation state of modern Germany, but the area of Central Europe where mostly German people, German-speaking people lived, right? And we talked about Otto the Great before in a previous video, and we talked about the investiture controversy, right? So this is the same territory that was ruled by Otto and then later Henry IV. And these are, so I'm going to be talking about that same area of Central Europe. Okay? Now, it was an empire. It was sometimes called the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation later. But it really was this collection of various places. A lot of different provinces, duchies. There were dukes of this, the count of that. A lot of bishoprics actually functioned as their own states in a way. And by the 12th century, you also had a number of cities that functioned as city-states. They were called free cities. So they were actually recognized by the emperor as having been able to control themselves. One of the problems for the emperors in Germany during the Middle Ages was they had no center of royal domain. So in France, for instance, the area around Paris was the royal domain. And they were also elected. Although dynasties did exist, and there's an example of one in the picture there, they were technically elected, as we talked about before. So this made things difficult to have as strong a monarchy develop in the German-speaking lands as happened in France and England. The guy in the picture there, one of the more well-known emperors of the 12th century, his name was Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick I. Barbarossa means red beard, as you can tell. These are two of Frederick's sons in the picture standing beside him, so that you can see his red beard. Now, he had been the Duke of Swabia, which would be southwestern Germany today. Okay, so that part of Germany, which is the southwestern area. And their family were known as the Hohenstaufen. And the Hohenstaufen really established a dynasty during this period. He becomes emperor in 1152, and you can see he ruled as emperor for quite a long time. So that's one thing that makes him significant. Sometimes just being around a while makes you significant. He did centralize authority more than most emperors had for a while. And probably going back to Otto the Great might have been the last guy that has much centralized authority as him. Maybe you could argue some others, but it's not that big a deal. So what he did was use these feudal oaths, right? So, and he wasn't the only one who did this, but kings tried to use the feudal relationships where they made these oaths between lords and vassals. We talked about that before, as a way to get nobles and sometimes church officials, often church officials like bishops, to swear oaths of loyalty to them. Okay, so he did try to centralize power that way. He also tried to lead a war he didn't try to lead a war. He did lead a war against the Italian city-states because technically, as he was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he asserted control over northern Italy. But the Italian city-states and the papacy didn't really like him doing this, and so there was a war. And in fact, he lost that war. The papacy, the Pope, and many of the Italian city-states fought against him. They defeated him in 1176. He was actually excommunicated for a time. later reconciling with the papacy. We're going to see later, let me go back to Frederick. We'll see later, I'm going to talk about Frederick in the context of the Crusades also, like Richard. So he's important for the Crusades too. Let me finish up this video with this little section. Some just overall changes that happened in Europe, particularly during this time. You can see similar developments in places where population grew a lot, like in China during this time. Okay, so there are comparisons there. And in fact, China was most likely more advanced technologically during much of this time and also had larger population. But generally speaking, there was a warming trend in the world that started before 1000. I talk about this also in the video that I did on the Black Death, the first video on the Black Death. So there was this warming trend, that started probably maybe in the late 9th century, but really became evident by 1000. And that warming trend lasted till about 1300. And after that, you have the Little Ice Age, which I pick up on in the other video on the Black Death. But this general warming trend was very important. It allowed a bigger production of crops farther north. Okay, so with the warming trend, you could produce crops for a longer period of time farther north, and this helped Europeans, generally speaking, but anybody who was farther north, right? We just know a little bit more about, or at least I know more about what was going on in Europe. And also during this time, you had an agricultural revolution take place, and these things obviously go together. So the population increased greatly during this time. So there were three things with the agricultural production that went revolution. The heavy plow. So this was a heavier plow that could dig deeper into the ground, right? And it would produce better soil turnup and therefore better crops. The expansion of the three-field system. Generally speaking, they used the two-field system. Before the three-field system, you could get more production of crops and would also rotate the crops and therefore have more nutrients in the soil because you would let more field. You would still have a fallow field, but you would be using more production and rotate two crops more often, basically. And third, you have the rigid horse collar. The rigid horse collar allowed an animal to pull that heavy plow without choking it. So those were all technological or agricultural innovations that helped agriculture take off along with that general warming trend, and that led to an increase in population. Increase in population led to the growth of villages into towns and towns into cities. Okay? Now, Europe's population was still, as I said, most likely definitely smaller than China, for instance. The Middle East probably had, in some places, at least larger cities. I'd have to look at population numbers more generally that we know about, but definitely larger cities. But you did have a population growth, and many of the villages that became towns, that became cities later of Europe during this period, developed. They might have existed before that, but they became more significant. And the way we think of European cities, kind of the old traditional European city, developed during this period. And you can see this if you go to certain places that haven't been destroyed because of war or some other reason. So you also had the emergence of a new class of people in the cities, right? And this is why they're called burghers, because the German word for a fortress here, a walled city or fortress, was a burg. The French word is bourg, and the English word is borough. Okay? So basically you had somebody who lives in one of these is a burgher. So somebody who is from Hamburg is a Hamburger. Yes, that's a bad joke I use every time. So these cities become very significant, and you can still go see, if you go to certain cities, say in Germany or in France, and they still have a lot of this old town feel to it. You can see where this existed in the late Middle Ages, and a lot of this began during this period. The other thing that happened during this period, with the expansion of trade, and by the 1200s, by the 13th century, you have trade lines stretching from China across, was the further development of a money economy again. So the production of money, the use of metal currency, becomes more and more prevalent the longer this period goes on.